All right, well, we're live. Don't know what happened to the intro there, but we're live. Welcome to In the Cut. My name is Kevon Cameron. I am your host. Good afternoon. In the Cut is the show that gets you up close and personal with BN on all the good happenings here at Black Nonbelievers. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Kevon Cameron. I am the organizer for Black Nonbelievers of New York. This show is a production of Black Nonbelievers. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization headquartered in the Atlanta area. We connect with Blacks and other allies who are living their lives free of religion and who might otherwise be shunned by their families, friends, and by providing caring, friendly, and informative community. Instead of accepting dogma, we determine the truth and morality through reason and evidence. The mission of Black Nonbelievers is to provide secular fellowship, nourish and support nonbelievers in coming out, encourage pride in non-religious identities, and educate the public on the history and current state of non-belief in the Black community. We also organize events and charitable causes. Black Nonbelievers does not discriminate regardless of age, gender, sexual identity, national origin, racial identity. However, our content and our work prioritizes Black non-religious voices. Just as a reminder, we are airing this show every first and third Saturday of the month. So make sure to tune in to us 2 weeks from today on the third Saturday of February. Just before I get into the show, I just wanted to remind you guys to check us out on all the platforms. Make sure that you subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already done that. Be sure to follow us on social media, Black Nonbelievers across all platforms. Search us in there. Also, check us out, Black Nonbelievers on Meetup. That's where we started. Check us out if you're within driving distance of one of our cities, New York, DC, Portland, Black Nonbelievers on Meetup. And don't forget, of course, to support us at Black Nonbelievers on .org. Sorry, BlackNonbelievers.org. Support us there. Make sure you make a financial contribution if you're able. All right. So just a quick reminder, the Religious Trauma Coaching Group, Group 1 is next Saturday, February the 12th. Group 2 is February 26th. Slots are available for both groups. You can check that out, Black Nonbelievers, BlackNonbelievers.org/religious trauma group coaching. Remember, we spoke about that on our first show, so be sure to check that out. Final reminder, of course, the BNCCon 2022. Of course, BNCCon is our annual cruise. This year, we're going to a bunch of different locations, including Cozumel, if I remember correctly. Make sure you check that out. That's also on our BN website. You can also go to bnccon.com and check that out. So now that the announcements are out of the way, I would like to introduce our very special guest. I'm very familiar with this guy. He's a really great author, great speaker. Our guest today is Chris Cameron. Chris is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He's the founder and past president of African American Intellectual History Society. Cameron received his BA in history from the Nice State College and his MA and PhD in American history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research and teaching interests include early American history, the history of slavery and abolition, and American religious and intellectual history. Cameron is the author of To Plead Our Own Case, African Americans in Massachusetts, The Making of the Anti-Slavery Movement, and most notably, Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism. He is also the co-editor of New Perspectives in Black Intellectual Tradition. Okay, so Chris, welcome to our show. How's it been? It's nice to see you again.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you too.
No problem. I remember I first met you, was it a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago now, when you had Black Freethinkers out You came to New York to promote that. So I know your story, but for our audience, like we always ask our guests, tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to your perspectives.
Yeah, sure. So, I wasn't raised particularly religious. My family background is my mom's side of the family is French Canadian. Didn't know my dad's side, so I was raised by them, and we'd go to like midnight mass on Christmas Eve, maybe church on Easter, but they weren't particularly religious. They identified as Catholics, but weren't religious. Now, when I would come around my stepdad's family, though, in the Bronx, they were very religious, evangelical Christians, right? Pentecostals. So even though I didn't really grow up going to church, I did grow up at certain moments, getting a lot of religious messages from my grandmother, for example, who was really, really super religious and, was telling me all about how to be saved and everything. But pretty much for most of my childhood, right up until I turned 18, I didn't have any particular religious identification myself. I guess I sort of believed in God, but I kind of lived my life as if God didn't exist and wouldn't punish me for anything. And that's sort of evident in the fact that a week before I turned 18, I found myself sitting in a county jail up in New Hampshire, arrested on 5 felony drug charges. And that would actually that would actually be the beginning of a somewhat short-lived religious journey. So maybe 2 weeks or so into my time in county up in Manchester, New Hampshire. I was reading this book, Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy. It has a heavy religious message in it. Started to think back on all the stuff my grandmother had told me and everything, and I'm sitting in jail. I'm alone, right? Don't know how long I'm gonna be in there, and I had this sort of dramatic jailhouse conversion, right? Accepted Jesus as my savior, blah blah blah, all of that. And throughout, I would spend 8 months in jail. And throughout my time there, I would do, I would go to the little services and Bible study that another inmate led, this dude called Brother Mike. So I would do that. I read the Bible cover to cover a couple of times, didn't have a whole lot to do in there. And the books were sort of limited, what we had access to. So I read the Bible, I prayed a lot, was going to change my life and everything like that. So I got pretty religious for a while I was locked up. Then I got out. Just about 20 years ago now. In fact, today is the 20-year anniversary of when I got sentenced, February 5th, 2002. And then I would spend 19 more days in jail, and I'd get out February 24th, 2002. When I got out, the sort of really heavy religious element, it didn't stick with me in terms of me going to church or kind of getting involved in any specific religious institution. But I was on probation for 2 years. And as part of my probation, I actually had to do 3 Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous meetings because I'd been arrested for drug charges. So even though I wasn't going to church, it was like kind of quasi church, right? Because, AA and NA, they say that they're not religious organizations. They say that they're not affiliated with any religion. But if you're an atheist in AA or NA, you're just going to feel very out of place. I mean, they would try to be open to non-believers and say, oh, your higher power could be good, orderly direction, right? God. But it wasn't particularly convincing. They're saying the Serenity Prayer and the Lord's Prayer at all of these meetings. So yeah, I kind of bought in to the whole AA and NA thing, in large part because I wanted to stay out of jail, right? I hated jail. I think everybody that's in there hates it, but the overwhelming majority of people don't hate it to actually change their behavior afterwards and stay out, right? Most people who are convicted of felonies, close to 90% of people who are convicted of felonies end up going back, right? I hated it so much that I wanted to stay out. So I bought in to the whole AA thing and kept up with that until I was finished with probation. This was in 2004 that I finished up my probation, even kept up with it for a few months afterwards. And then it just sort of dropped off when I didn't have to do it anymore. I would actually finally affiliate with the church when I started going to graduate school in 2006. So a quick educational story. I was a high school dropout before I got locked up. I got my GED while I was in jail. And then as part of my probation, I had to take 2 college level classes. So I started going to community college, did that till the end of 2003. And then it would transfer to a 4-year school, Keene State College, in 2004. And that's where I got my bachelor's. So a couple of years later, in 2006, I moved down to North Carolina to go to UNC to work on my master's and my PhD. And I was just sort of searching for community, right? I was one of the few Black people in my history PhD program. I was really super interested in African American history and social justice and history of race in America. And growing up mixed race, living largely in New Hampshire, I just never really felt connected to the Black side of me, right? So when I got to UNC, I was sort of searching for that, the whole tragic mulatto theme. So I started looking for different churches to join. Initially, I went to the Nation of Islam. I was real into Malcolm X and everything. And I was really turned off from the Nation because, in large part because of their discrimination against white people. I mean, one of the things that the minister of the NOI Temple in Durham, North Carolina, we were talking a little bit about my background and stuff. The first day I went there, they're very suspicious of outsiders. So if you show up and you don't usually go there, then they're going to sort of quiz you about who you are, why you're there, all that. And so I told him a little bit about myself, and he was like, well, I mean, you're welcome here. But we don't let white people in the temple. So I'm like, okay, well, this isn't really for me, right? Eventually, I ended up going to St. Paul's AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Chapel Hill, and would join that church. I'd be baptized there. This was probably in like September, October 2006, very shortly after I started graduate school. And I would be really active in that congregation for something like 6 to 8 months, right? I was thinking earlier about, what is the sort of defining moment? Where can I sort of look and see this is when my sort of path towards being a non-believer started? And oddly enough, it came just from watching a movie. I finally traced everything back to watching this one movie. I was watching The Hurricane, right? The story of Reuben Hurricane Carter, wrongfully imprisoned for murder, spent like, I think 25, 30 years or something like that in prison. And this was really a random moment in the movie, but at one point they showed an image of this book called The Awakening of Intelligence, right? Didn't show the author or anything. I couldn't see that, but I could see the title of the book. And so I just went and looked up the book. It seemed interesting, right? It was by this Indian philosopher named Jiddu Krishnamurti. And I read it, and then I started buying all of his books. His books are largely just transcriptions of speeches. He wasn't like a huge writer himself, but he talked a lot, right? Gave seminars and workshops and speeches all around the world. So people just recorded his talks and then put it into books. And a lot of his message really resonated with my experience in the AME church. I joined it because I was looking for community. I was looking for friends, for a sense of kind of purpose for myself. Didn't necessarily join it because I agreed with its theology or even knew the theology particularly. I mean, what pushed me to walk in the doors in the first place was my historical studies of the importance of the AME Church within sort of the long Black freedom struggle, right? Stretching back to Richard Allen founding it in 1793. So, but you know, even though I joined, even though I was baptized there, I always felt like something was off, right? I just felt kind of uncomfortable. It was partly, you know, when the minister's like, all right, stand now and pray now and sing now, it just all felt so contrived to me, right? It didn't really feel like a natural, like the rituals, the service, it didn't feel like a natural expression of my own religious feelings. I wasn't particularly emotive or expressive in my religious sentiments. So when people were catching the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues, I'm just looking at them like, really? And why is the Holy Spirit catching the same person at the same moment in the service every single week, right? You would think the Holy Spirit would be a little less discriminating. And so I'm having these kind of doubts as I'm in the church and as I'm reading Jiddu Krishnamurti, especially some of his writings on religion. A lot of what he talks about in his works is that, you know, we follow our particular religious traditions out of sort of blind faith, out of fear, because some other authority has told us like this is the true belief, right? And we really don't even question the religions that we've grown up with, right? And so it's just all about sort of blind faith and following tradition for the sake of tradition. And something just really clicked in me there after reading Krishnamurti. And I realized like this AME church just is not for me, right? It doesn't feel authentic. That wasn't quite the end of my, you know, I didn't become an atheist right then. I did a little more seeking. Particularly, I started going to the Quaker meeting in Chapel Hill. And that actually, the sort of type of practice in a Quaker meeting, that really did resonate with me. I'm a very quiet and kind of contemplative person. So I could get with the religious service where we're just sort of sitting there meditating, right? And we would go through sometimes a whole 45 minutes to an hour where nobody was moved by their inner light that Quakers believed in. Nobody was moved to talk. So we would just sit there in quiet meditation and stuff. And I could get with that. But it was also, it was a meeting that had very little to no diversity at all. So that sort of turned me off. And then towards the end of my first year in grad school, 2007, moving into 2008, I was reading all of Krishnamurti stuff. And that's when I started to come across some of the works of new atheist authors, right? Which obviously we, you know, are problematic in a number of ways that I didn't know about at the time, but their religious arguments, right, were convincing to me. Folks like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harrison Dawkins. And finally, after reading The God Delusion, I was like, okay, you know, I believe this. I'm an atheist now. And so, yeah, that's basically my story. Grew up not particularly religious, dramatic jailhouse conversion, kind of religious in AA for a bit, joined a church. And then eventually it was some of my philosophical readings and finally getting into the secular literature about 14 years ago now that brought me to atheism.
Okay. That's cool. Thanks for sharing that. I thought I knew you better than that. I guess I know your professional history better than I knew your personal.
Yeah, I've never shared this like personal stuff with you. I don't think I might have talked a little bit about, you know, reading some new atheist writers, but I don't think in any of the talks I've given that you've attended, I've really gone into that whole trajectory.
It's very interesting.
Especially the jail stuff. I've been kind of low key about that, but I'm at a point now where I've sort of achieved my professional goals. So I don't think being really open about having, been a felon and been to jail or anything is going to hurt me anymore. So I'm like, whatever, I'll talk about it now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they can't stop you now. Also,
Yeah.
I have to side note, really agree with you on the AA thing. I a little too personal. When I was in DC, I was really into a woman who was in AA. So I went to a couple of meetings with her, and I found it to be the most depressing thing I had ever seen. I mean, they seemed to get into it, and really, it seemed to help some people. I don't know, but I found it's super depressing. But yeah, it does seem like you tried out a lot, at least several different kinds of religion, though. You gave it a shot.
Yeah, I really did. And when I do something, I go all in, right? So when I joined St. Paul's AME Church, for example, I stopped listening to regular hip hop. I tried to listen to Christian authors or Christian rappers and all of this stuff. And yeah, I was pretty deep into it. The Bible study a couple nights a week, and church a couple nights a week, and was even very briefly dating the youth minister there. So I was all about it for a while, until I realized it just wasn't for me.
Okay, makes sense. I completely understand that. So we're in Black History Month now. Why is it important that the contributions of Black secularists historically and currently are included in those narratives? Because you've written a lot about Black secularists, especially in your book Black Free Thought. So why is that important to note, especially this time of year?
Sure. Well, really, the key argument of Black Freethinkers is that secularism has been a central component of African American political and intellectual life from the era of slavery, right? So I show that enslaved people in the early to mid 19th century began to embrace atheism, in large part due to the prevalence of pro-slavery religion and the sort of hypocritical religious professions of their masters. And we see some of the leading Black abolitionists and women's rights advocates like Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown in the antebellum era in the late 19th centuries, embracing certain aspects of free thought, right? So really from sort of the start of abolitionism and Black political activity, we have secular thinkers who are really at the forefront. And that would become much more pronounced during the early 20th century, right? So I talk about in chapter 2, for example, the sort of leadership and prominence of Black freethinkers in the Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro Renaissance, as more recent scholars are referring to it as. But authors like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, Elaine Locke, Claude McKay, right? Some of the leading intellectuals, writers, and artists during this time period were atheists or agnostics, right? And highly critical of African American religion and American religion more broadly, right? And they expressed this through the writings published during the Harlem Renaissance, right? Through poems from Langston Hughes, like "Song for a Dark Girl," novels like Nella Larson's 1928 novel "Quicksand," even elements of Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God," although her secular perspective comes out most prominently in some of her anthropological works, and especially her autobiography "Dust Tracks on a Road." But we can see that this particular moment of the Harlem Renaissance was really a ripe one for freethinkers, right? In large part because it really brought together a lot of religious skeptics who, in their sort of rural, Midwestern or Southern communities, they were perhaps the only, Black freethinker or atheist or agnostic around, right? Langston Hughes in Joplin, Missouri, for example, or Zora Neale Hurston in Eatonville, Florida. But then when they came together in Harlem, or other cities, right, Chicago and Detroit, when they came together in these cities, it provided an opportunity for community, right, to just be around other like-minded people who believed or did not believe, as the case might be, in particular religious ideas, right? And so whereas the majority of Black Harlemites in the 1920s would be going to church on a Sunday morning, a lot of these Harlem Renaissance writers and activists and intellectuals would gather together in A. Philip Randolph's living room and debate politics and debate religion and economic theory and socialism and all of that, right? And that sort of leads me into the prominence of Black freethinkers in the Black radical tradition, right? The tradition that saw Blacks become increasingly dedicated to the socialist and communist parties during the 1920s and 1930s, and really embracing sort of economic radicalism and strident critiques of Christianity, right? And so for activists and intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Hubert Harrison, Louise Thompson Patterson, and Harry Haywood, for them, Christianity, capitalism, and sort of Western imperialism and colonization were all very intimately tied together, right? So Hubert Harrison and Harry Haywood in particular wrote and spoke extensively about how this kind of combination of capitalism and Christianity was in large part responsible for the persistence and the strength of Jim Crow in the United States, and apartheid and colonialism more broadly in various African nations, right? So in their minds, religion and economics were intimately linked together, right? So you saw folks who embraced the communist parties becoming atheist, and vice versa, right? Those who are already atheists or already agnostic, sort of being attracted to these more kind of radical political alternatives, right? And this is something where if you read the scholarship and you read the literature on African American socialists and communists and the Black radical tradition more broadly, there were a number of different factors attributed to the rise of the Black radical tradition, whether it's World War II and increased sort of migration and mobility throughout the African diaspora, or whether it was economic troubles in Caribbean nations that, might have a larger portion of socialists and is pushing them to move to the United States, right? There's a lot of different explanations for the rise of the Black radical tradition, but one that I saw was missing was this also kind of concurrent rise of African American secularism, right? So that's another sort of key political and intellectual moment where we see African American secularism being really prominent. And finally, if we're looking, if we sort of jump ahead a couple of decades and look at the era of the civil rights movement, this is a movement that has been overwhelmingly portrayed by scholars as a religious movement. And, in part for good reason, right? Of course, churches were important in the civil rights movement, and it was led in large part by religious leaders. But that's caused people, I think, to ignore the critical importance of secular thinkers and secular activists in the civil rights and Black power movements, and just in the sort of intellectual life of Black communities in the 1960s and early 1970s more broadly, right? So this is where we see the rise to prominence of writers like James Baldwin, right, who harshly critiqued the Christianity that he preached up until For a 3-year period between 14 and 17 years old. He was a Pentecostal preacher in Harlem, and then finally realized that his preaching wasn't having the intended effect, and he wanted his congregation to actually start to take matters into their own hands and organize politically instead of just praying for things to change. We see Baldwin, we see Lorraine Hansberry. You have atheists starting organizations like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. So Huey Newton grew up in a religious household, eventually moved away from it, kind of like me after reading philosophy at Merritt College in the early 1960s, eventually would embrace existentialism and atheism. And he would team up with folks like Eldridge Cleaver, who embraced atheism while he was locked up, reading Tom Paine and other American freethinkers. And they would help to form one of the most important political organizations of the 1960s, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which provided sort of an organizational body for the emerging ideology of Black power that sort of arose right around the same time. So whether we're looking at artists and intellectuals of the 1960s, political activists like Huey Newton and Stokely Carmichael was another, James Foreman, the executive director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In most of the major civil rights organizations of the 1960s, as well as in the Black arts movement, and even in Black theology, right? The philosopher William R. Jones kind of critiquing some of the key elements of James Cone's Black theology. We see once again Black secular thinkers and activists really being at the forefront of civil rights organizing and activity during the 1960s. So there's really no moment in American history, in African American and American history, where African American secularism has not been central to our intellectual life and to our political struggles, right? Our numbers have been few, but secularism has been convincing enough to a particular portion of the population, right? Du Bois, Zora Neale Hurston. I mean, these are our leading thinkers and our leading activists. So even though the numbers were few, Black secularism has played sort of an outsized role within our history, right? And that's why I think it's important, especially during Black History Month, to sort of lift this up. But it's not without its consequences, right? There are some people that don't want to hear this story. I was actually recently invited to give a talk at a senior citizens home in Charlotte. And I was they asked me to give a talk on sort of the foundings of Black History Month, which I know a little bit about, but I would have had to do sort of significant research to prepare for the talk. So instead I said, I'm happy to give a talk, but it would have to be on my recent book, right? I don't have a ton of prep time. So I sent them a link to the book, and they wrote back to me and said, well, I don't think our residents would be interested in this. So thank you for your time, right? So that definitely happens, and that's fine, but I'm not going to stop sort of telling this story. And, my first book goes up to 1975. And I'm going to write a second book, basically taking the story from 1975 up till about 2020, right? And really talk about how where we see Black freethinkers in other organizations, right? In the Black Panther Party, in SNCC during the 1960s and 1970s, the 1980s and 90s would start to witness the creation of our own secular organizations, specifically for us, right? When Norm Allen Jr. founded African Americans for Humanism in 1989. And then, of course, when Mandisa founded BlackNonbelievers in 2011, which was also the same year that Ayanna Watson founded, I think, Black Atheists of America.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Yeah, it's really crazy because I literally before you came to New York for your last book, I literally had just no idea. This wasn't like I'd been organizing for a secular meetup group for Black people, and I just never even heard of, oh well, these people. There were some of these people who just definitely weren't religious. It literally just, it was never a thing. It was never covered in school. That absolutely wasn't covered in any church service I was ever forced to go to. I'd never heard this anywhere, even from other Black atheists. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, and that's no accident, right? I mean, think of the people that I've mentioned today, right? We know about Frederick Douglass. Every 4th of July, people are quoting, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," and everything like that. We know about Du Bois, and most high school students, the Black History Month reading is probably "Their Eyes Are Watching God" by Zora Neale Hurston. But you're not reading Zora Neale Hurston's Dust Tracks on a Road, where she's talking about the fact that she doesn't know if there's a God. And even if there is a God, it doesn't make sense to pray to that God because he's probably so removed from human life that he doesn't even care about us, right? She's articulating basically kind of an agnostic position, or the same deist position that Tom Paine articulated in The Age of Reason that caused such a scandal back then, right? So these are people that we know about them, we know about their works, but that particular aspect of their identity is downplayed or hidden because it would portray them, and by extension the race, in a bad light, right? I mean, we're still, even now, at a moment where there's this notion that what one Black person does is kind of a reflection on the entire race, right? So a white person could go and shoot up a school or something, and that doesn't make all white people violent terrorists or whatever, but let a Black person do it, and that reflects on all of us, right? So that notion has been very prominent throughout American history, and it's one of the reasons that I think that people have really downplayed and tried to ignore this prominent history of Black secularism, right? Because it would portray the entire race in a bad light. It would show that we're immoral or amoral, not worthy of citizenship, and would provide an argument against our claims and our calls for the end of slavery, if we're talking the 19th century, or an end to Jim Crow segregation, if we're looking at the 20th.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I wanted to ask you, especially given your knowledge of history in general, especially your knowledge of Black history, are you into the whole Black historical fiction type thing, like your sort of Lovecraft Country type stuff? Is that type of thing are you into that at all?
Not a whole lot, no. So I mean, I use some novels in the book. I talk about Native Son, for example, and some of Nella Larson's work, but I haven't been thus far, and it's something that I need to change, especially because I'm going to have an entire chapter on secularism and African American literature after 1975 in the new book, right? And it's going to feature, at least right now, I know it's going to feature Alice Walker and Octavia Butler's work pretty prominently. So I've come across a speech that Octavia Butler gave that indicated she's an atheist. Alice Walker, we know, won the Humanist of the Year award in 1996, and has articulated kind of like pagan ideas of her religiosity. So yeah, I got into them a little bit. I included them in the afterword of Black Freethinkers, but I'm going to sort of delve into their writings and those of a lot more kind of contemporary Black authors quite a bit over the next few years. But right now, I haven't been too much.
Yeah, I haven't gotten too much into it. I people telling me that Watchmen has some Black Wall Street stuff in it, and I just haven't been able to sit down and super get into that so far. But it definitely seems interesting. I love any sort of historical fiction, well, not any, but a lot of historical fiction is really cool. Real quick, on January 22nd, you participated in a panel titled "The Black Non-Religious Fight for Racial Justice." It was with the Pittsburgh Racial Justice Summit. How did you get into that?
Well, Mandisa asked me if I wanted to do it. And usually when Mandisa asks me to do something, I jump on it, right? I always try to support Black non-believers however I can. So I agreed to join the panel. And a lot of what I talked about there was really what I just mentioned right a few minutes ago, this long history of the kind of intersections of African-American secularism and racial justice in the United States, right? And for Black atheists, really dating back to the 19th century, they saw, for Black atheists or agnostics, their religious positions weren't simply a lack of belief, like a lot of people sort of accuse us of. Their positions were usually combined with humanism, right? Even if we were before the point where that really came into the lexicon in the United States, and they felt that their lack of religion actually sort of pushed them to be more active and engaged in political causes, right? So that's a lot of what I discussed is how Blacks' atheism, agnosticism, and free thought more broadly has really ignited and sustained a long tradition of social justice in the United States. So that's primarily what I did, just kind of an overview and a historical perspective that this is something that's been going on in the country since the 1830s, 1840s, and it's something that we can still use today to motivate us, right? For those who are sort of on the fence about religion, for those who think they might be atheists or already are, but aren't sort of, out there all the way yet, that you can still be very socially conscious and politically active. And indeed, some of the leading Black freethinkers throughout African-American history have also been our political leaders and our kind of thought leaders in the community.
Yeah, it's really crazy. It's you're doing good work, Chris. You're doing like work that literally I don't see anyone else out there doing. You're talking about stuff that I've never heard of before, which is really needed within the community, within the entire Black community, not just the Black secular community. Probably, I would say, needed more so outside of the Black secular community. It's really great. Well, thanks for coming on our show today. I want to make sure people remember to follow you on Twitter. Your Twitter, I just posted in. Is that correct?
Sorry, I lost you there for a second. It's CCamRun2.
Yeah, CCamRun2 on Twitter. Yeah. Make sure to follow Chris on Twitter. And if you haven't already, be sure to purchase Chris's books, Black Freethinkers, on Amazon or on Northwestern University Press if you haven't already. It's a great book. It really enlightens you on like what's going on, what has been going on in Black historical free thought. It's not all just religion. So yeah, thanks again for coming on, Chris. Before I let you go, do you have anything else that you'd like to, anything coming up or anything you want to promote?
Just give a quick plug for my most recent book. Sort of diverges a little bit from the theme of Black Non-Believers. It's called Race, Religion, and Black Lives Matter, Essays on a Moment and a Movement. It does have an essay specifically on Black humanism expressed through music, right? Through Beyonce's Lemonade, for example, or some of Kendrick Lamar's music. And I have a chapter on this really fascinating new organization called Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, which is trying to, and it is kind of melding the theology of Unitarian Universalism with the kind of political commitments and ideology of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I sort of situate that in this history of Blacks' engagement with American religious liberalism, which at times does intersect with the history of free thought, right? Many Black UUs have been atheists or agnostics, although not exclusively, right? They're a very sort of theologically diverse group. So yeah, just give a quick plug if you're interested in Black Lives Matter and its ideology. You might be interested in that book.
And what was the name again?
Race, Religion, and Black Lives Matter.
And where can people find that?
That's also, let's see, that's published through Vanderbilt University Press. So on their website, and it's also on Amazon.
Okay, great. Chris, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you at American Atheist. You'll be there, right?
Yep, I'll be there.
Easter weekend. Check that out. Thanks for coming on, Chris. I just like to, before we wrap up, I just like to remind everybody to, of course, subscribe and like the videos. It really helps us on YouTube. Be sure to check us out on social media. It's BlackNonbelievers on social media. Make sure that you check us out also on where we first started on meetup.com. It's BlackNonbelieversmeetup.com. And also don't forget to head on over to BlackNonbelievers.org to support us financially if you can. Also, do not forget, we do have coming up the religious trauma coaching groups. First group is on February 12th, and the second group, of course, is on February 26th. And again, check us out for the BNCCon. It's our cruise coming up in November. That is a wrap for today. Thanks for joining us. I really hope to see you next time, and goodbye.